In Venezuela, the declaration of President Nicolas Maduro as winner of the country's recent presidential election is generating local and international attention. The result of the election is being widely rejected, with the electoral body being accused of fraudulent acts. This has led to widespread protest. We have a report.
In Venezuela, protests have erupted across the country over the official declaration of President Nicolas Maduro by the Electoral Authority, the winner of an election that the opposition says was marred by fraud. In the state of Falcon, demonstrators toppled a statue of President Nicolas' predecessor, Hugo Chavez. In one of the poorest parts of the country's capital, Caracas, demonstrators chanted slogans against the president, and some masked young persons tore down his campaign posters from lampposts. Some protesters also headed towards the presidential palace, and police had to be deployed in large numbers across the city as members of the National Guard fired tear gas to disperse the demonstrators. Public anger swelled after the National Electoral Council on Monday formally confirmed that President Maduro had been re-elected by a majority of Venezuelans to another 6-year term as president from 2025 to 2031. But the electoral body, controlled by President Maduro's loyalists, has not released the tallies from each of the 30,000 polling stations across Venezuela, fueling political tension in the South American nation and calls for transparency. Opposition representatives say the counts they collected from campaign representatives at the centers show presidential candidate Edmundo Gonzalez leading. In a press conference on Monday evening, opposition leader Maria Corina Machado claimed her coalition had more than 70% of the votes tallied and catalogued in an online database. On the other side, Venezuelans residing in Spain gathered for a rally at Puerta del Sol in Madrid on Monday afternoon to protest against alleged electoral fraud in their home country. Hundreds of people, joined by prominent figures from the opposition, demanded recognition of the victory of Edmundo Gonzalez. The demonstrations aim to raise awareness on discontent with the electoral process in Venezuela.
And for more on this, global affairs analyst Colin Soweke joins me now from Belgium. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, Precious, for having me.
So we see that there is now protests, in Caracas, Venezuela, following the results of the election. But we know that pre- and post-election protests are not unusual in Venezuela. But when you add these protests to regional and international condemnation, can President Maduro ride out this turmoil and cling on to office?
President Maduro has, been able to, withstand similar challenges in the past, amongst which is the biting, American sanction against them that brought about, the economic hardship that the country is going through and has even not recovered as of this moment. Now, this is a challenge of a different nature. His last election, for want of another word to use, was also marred by quite a lot of controversies. But there appear to be an edge to this specific one, this specific protest and conflicts that appears to suggest that he is more and more in a tightening corner. Let's not forget, Precious, that only this morning, he has had to expel about 7, and I mean 7, South American diplomats that are in Caracas because they supported the protest and actually claimed that indeed the election was marred by irregularities and that there appeared to be fraud. So with such seeming, isolation I think it's difficult for him to be able to weather this particular storm. But wait and see. That's the message.
Let's talk more about this isolation, because you remember that in 2023, the Biden administration broadly eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. And that was in response to a deal that was reached between, I think it was the government and opposition parties for this particular election. Now, January this year, the United States again reimposed those sanctions. That was when the top court in that country upheld the disqualification. I think it was of the opposition presidential hopeful. Now that this election has gone this way, how do you expect the U.S. to respond now?
Well, the U.S. has basically given us some signs in January this year of what they are most likely to do. I think they are going to tighten up the screw they are using to push Maduro right in a corner. And I mean, it is not by coincidence that these 7 South American countries have actually spoken out against, the electoral practices and the fraud that actually occurred there. I think that is part of America's plan. They are going to build a very, very strong international coalition against Venezuela. And so what they saw up until 2023, when the sanction was eased, like you rightly pointed out, is going to be a child's play compared to what is going to happen, this time around as America's, response to this obnoxious practice of electoral malpractice.
And what sort of ripple effect do you see these post-election developments having on the region?
Well, there are quite a number of, what you can consider to be rogue nations in those, in that, sub-region. Mexico appears to be doing, fantastically well. I mean, in terms of democratization, only recently, we saw the election of the first, female president there, something that hasn't happened in many other countries. And so, yes, some people, some nations of the South American axis will actually be learning from what is happening here, because obviously they are sharpening their rigging tools so that they will rig their way into the presidential palace. But what is happening in Venezuela now will actually send a strong message. So if we do not see a ripple effect, in the negative side, which means more riggings and authoritarianism, it is because they are actually afraid of the consequences, not because they have now suddenly embraced democracy.
But do you also see some of these countries struggling with a balance? Because on one hand, people have said, look, it is the sanctions by the U.S. that has led to some of the economic meltdown we've seen in Venezuela. But there are also those who are saying they are going to leave the country because they cannot stand another 6-year term of President Maduro. So on one hand, you are seeing people leave because of the economic meltdown. There are people who are going to leave again. Migration will increase because of the situation there. So countries do not want people, to migrate to their countries. And so they're going to try and, do you see that struggle with the balance?
Well, yes. I mean, in other words, Precious, what you have just talked about is national and security interests of the neighboring countries, one of which is, the strongest, of course, in the area, being United States of America. Yes, there is very, very serious concern about, the influx of refugees into other countries. And so, yes, when the United States leads the fight against, what is happening in Venezuela today, it is doing so not because it loves the Venezuelans that much, but simply because, they are fighting for their own national interests by way of preventing, the ripple effect of, the crisis there from spreading further. And so that appears to be the strongest message, the strongest weapon that the United States, and other powers, other regional powers like Mexico would actually have in actually persuading the reluctant ones to come along with them. Of course, they're going to, do some trade-offs by way of economic trade incentives to enable them cooperate, but ultimately it's going to be every cent invested in countering what is happening in Venezuela today is going to be a cent well invested.
I mean, interesting, developments there. We're following to see how long President Maduro can ride this out. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure to have you on Collins Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst.
Thank you, Precious. Always a pleasure too. Thanks.